The Eleusinian Mysteries by Thomas Taylor. Published 1891. Read by Dan Attrell. It only now remains that we prove in the last place that a representation of the descent of the soul formed no inconsiderable part of these mystic shows. This, indeed, is doubtless occultly intimated by Virgil when speaking of the souls of the blessed in Elysium. He says, "All these, after they have passed away 1,000 years, are summoned by the Divine One in great array to the Levian river. In this way they become forgetful of their former earth life, and revisit the vaulted realms of the world, willing again to return into bodies." But openly by Apuleius in the following prayer, which Psyche addresses to Ceres, "I beseech thee by thy fruit-bearing right hand, by the joyful ceremonies of harvest, by the occult sacred rites of thy Kistae, and by the winged car of thy attending dragons, and the furrows of the Sicilian soil, and the rapacious chariot, and the dark descending ceremonies attending the marriage of Proserpina, and the ascending rites which accompanied the lightened return of thy daughter, and by other arcana which Eleusis the Attic sanctuary conceals in profound silence, relieve the sorrows of thy wretched suppliant, Psyche." For the abduction of Proserpina signifies the descent of the world, as is evident from the passage previously adduced from Olympiodorus, in which he says the soul descends chorically, and that this is confirmed by the authority of the philosopher Sallust, who observes that the abduction of Proserpina is fabled to have taken place about the opposite equinoctial, and by this the descent of souls into earth life is implied. And as the mystery abduction of Proserpina was exhibited in the dramatic representations of the mysteries, as is clear from Apuleius, it indisputably follows that this represented the descent of the soul and its union with the dark tenement of the body. Indeed, if the ascent and descent of the soul and its condition while connected with a material nature were represented in the dramatic shows of the mysteries, it is evident that this was implied by the abduction of Proserpina, and the former part of this assertion is manifest from Apuleius when describing his initiation. He says, in the passage already adduced, "I approached the confines of death, and having trodden on the threshold of Proserpina, I returned, having been carried through all the elements." And as to the latter part, it has been amply proven from the highest authority in the first division of this discourse. Nor must the reader be disturbed on finding that, according to Porphyry, as cited by Eusebius, the fable of Proserpina alludes to seed placed in the ground, for this is likewise true of the fable, considered according to its material explanation, but it will be proper on this occasion to rise a little higher, and consider the various species of fables according to their philosophical arrangement, since by this means the present subject will receive additional elucidation, and the wisdom of the ancient authors of fables will be vindicated from the unjust aspersions of ignorant declaimers. I shall present the reader, therefore, with the following interesting division of fables from the elegant book of the Platonic philosopher Sallust on the gods and the universe. "Of fables," says he, "some are theological, others are physical, others animistic, or relating to the soul, others material, and lastly, others are mixed from these. Fables are theological, which relate to nothing corporeal, but contemplate the very essences of the gods, such as the fables which assert that Saturn devoured his children, for it insinuates nothing more than the nature of an intellectual or intuitional god, since every such intellect returns into itself. We regard fables physically when we speak concerning the operations of the gods about the world. when considering Saturn the same as time and calling the parts of time the children of the universe, we assert that the children are devoured by their parent. But we utter fables in a spiritual mode when we contemplate the operations of the soul, because the intellections of our soul, though by a discursive energy they go forth into other things, yet abide in their parents. Lastly, fables are material, such as the Egyptians ignorantly employ, considering or calling corporeal natures divinities, such as Isis, earth, Osiris, humidity, Typhon, heat, or again, denominating Saturn, water, Adonis, fruits, and Bacchus, wine, and indeed to assert that these are dedicated to the gods in the same manner as herbs, stones, and animals is the part of wise men. But to call them gods is alone the province of fools and madmen, unless we speak in the same manner as when, from established custom, we call the orb of the sun and its rays the sun itself. But we may perceive the mixed kind of fables, as well in many other particulars, as when they relate that discord at a banquet of the gods threw a golden apple, and that a dispute about it arising among the goddesses, they were sent by Jupiter to take the judgment of Paris, who, charmed by the beauty of Venus, gave her the apple in preference to the rest. For in this fable the banquet denotes the supermundane powers of the gods, and on this account they subsist in conjunction with each other. But the golden apple denotes the world, which, on account of its composition from contrary natures, is not improperly said to be thrown by discord or strife. But again, since different gifts are imparted to the world by different gods, they appear to contest with each other for the apple. And a soul living according to sense, for this is Paris, not perceiving other powers in the universe, asserts that the apple is alone the beauty of Venus. But of these species of fables, such as are theological belong to philosophers, the physical and the spiritual to poets, but the mixed to the first of the initiatory rites, the teletais, since the intention of all mystic ceremonies is to conjoin us with the world and the gods. Thus far the excellent Sallust, from whence it is evident that the fable of Proserpina, as belonging to the mysteries, is properly of a mixed nature, or composed from all the four species of fables, the theological, the spiritual or psychical, and material. But in order to understand this divine fable, it is requisite to know that, according to the arcana of the ancient theology, the choric order, or the order belonging to Proserpina, is twofold, one part of which is supermundane, subsisting with Jupiter or the demiurge, and thus associated with him, establishing one artificer of divisible natures, but the other is mundane, in which Proserpina is said to have been ravished by Pluto and to animate the extremities of the universe. Hence, says Proclus, according to the statement of the theologians who delivered to us the most holy mysteries, Proserpina abides on high in those dwellings of her mother which she prepared for her in inaccessible places, exempt from the sensible world. But she likewise dwells beneath, with Pluto, administering terrestrial concerns, governing the recesses of the earth, supplying life to the extremities of the universe, and imparting soul to beings which are rendered by her inanimate and dead. Hence we may easily perceive that this fable is one of the mixed kind, one part of which relates to the supermundane establishment of the secondary cause of life, and the other to the procession or outgoing life and soul of the furthest extremity of things. Let us therefore more attentively consider the fable in that part of which it is symbolical of the descent of souls, in order to which it will be requisite to premise an abridgment of the arcane discourse respecting the wanderings of Ceres as preserved by Minutius Felix. Proserpina, says he, the daughter of Ceres by Jupiter, as she was gathering tender flowers in the new spring, was ravished from her delightful abode by Pluto, and being carried from thence through thick wood and over a length of sea, was brought by Pluto into a cavern, the residence of departed spirits, over whom she afterward ruled with absolute sway. But Ceres, upon discovering the loss of her daughter, with lighted torches and begirt with a serpent, wandered over the whole earth with the purpose of finding her, till she came to Eleusis. There she found her daughter, and also taught to the Eleusinians the cultivation of corn. Now, in this fable, Ceres represents the evolution of that institutional part of our nature which we properly denominate intellect, or the unfolding of intuitional faculty of the mind from its quiet and collected condition in the world of thought. And Proserpina, that living, self-moving, and animating part which we call soul. But lest this comparing of unfolded intellect to Ceres should seem ridiculous to the reader, unacquainted with the Orphic theology, it is necessary to inform him that this goddess, from her intimate union with Rhea, in conjunction with whom she produced Jupiter, is evidently of a Saturnian and zoogonic, or intellectual and vivific rank. And hence, as we are informed by the philosopher Sallust, among the mundane divinities, she is the deity from the planet Saturn. So that in consequence of this, our intellect, or intuitive faculty, in a descending state, must aptly symbolize with the divinity of Ceres. But Pluto signifies the whole of a material nature, since the empire of this god, according to Pythagoras, commences downward from the galaxy, or Milky Way, and the cavern signifies the entrance, as it were, into the profundities of such a nature, which is accomplished by the soul's unison with the terrestrial body. But in order to understand perfectly the secret meaning of the other parts of this fable, it will be necessary to give a more explicit detail of the particulars attending the abduction from the beautiful poem of Claudian on this subject. From this elegant production, we learn that Ceres, who was afraid lest some violence should be offered to Proserpina on account of her inimitable beauty, conveyed her privately to Sicily and concealed her in a house built for this purpose by the Cyclops, when she herself directs her course to the temple of Cybele, the mother of the gods. Here, then, we see the first cause of the soul's descent, namely, the abandoning of a life wholly according to the higher intellect, which is occultly signified by the separation of Proserpina from Ceres. Afterward, we are told that Jupiter instructs Venus to go to this abode and betray Proserpina from her retirement, that Pluto may be enabled to carry her away, and to prevent any suspicion in the virgin's mind, he commands Diana and Pallas to go in company. The three goddesses arriving find Proserpina at work on a scarf for her mother, in which she has embroidered the primitive chaos and the formation of the world. Now, by Venus in this part of the narration we must understand desire, which even in the celestial regions, for such is the residence of Proserpina till she is ravished by Pluto, begins silently and stealthily to creep into the recesses of the soul. By Minerva, we must conceive the rational power of the soul, and by Diana, nature, or the merely natural and vegetable part of our composition, both of which are now ensnared through the allurements of desire. And lastly, the web in which Proserpina had displayed all the fair variety of the material world beautifully represents the commencement of the elusive operation through which the soul becomes ensnared with the beauty of imaginative forms. Proserpina, forgetful of her parents' command, is represented as venturing from her retreat through the treacherous persuasions of Venus. And this with the greatest propriety, for oblivion necessarily follows a remission of intellectual action, and is as necessarily attended with the allurements of desire. Nor is her dress less symbolical of the acting of the soul in such a state, principally according to the energies and promptings of imagination and nature. For thus her garments are beautifully described by the poet, in which description the sun represents the fantasy and the moon nature, as is well known to every tyro in the Platonic philosophy. They are likewise with great propriety described in their infantine state, for these energies do not arrive to perfection previous to the sinking of the soul in the dark receptacle of matter. After this, we behold her issuing on the plain with Minerva and Diana, and attended by a beauteous train of nymphs, who are evident symbols of the world of generation, and are, therefore, the proper companions of the soul about to fall into its fluctuating realms. But the design of Proserpina, in venturing from her retreat, is beautifully significant of her approaching descent, for she rambles from home for the purpose of gathering flowers, and this in a lawn replete with the most enchanting variety, and exalting the most delicious odors. This is a manifest image of the soul operating principally according to the natural and external life, and so becoming effeminate and ensnared through the delusive attractions of sensible form. Minerva, the rational faculty in this case, likewise gives herself wholly to the dangerous employment, and abandons the proper characteristics of her nature for the destructive revels of desire, all which is described with the utmost elegance by the poet. But there is a circumstance relative to the Narcissus which must not be passed over in silence. I mean its being, according to Ovid, the metamorphosis of a youth who fell victim to the love of his own corporeal form, the secret meaning of which most admirably accords with the abduction of Proserpina, which, according to Homer, was the immediate consequence of gathering this wonderful flower. For by Narcissus, falling in love with his shadow in the limpid stream, we may behold an exquisitely apt representation of a soul vehemently gazing on the flowing condition of a material body, and in consequence of this, becoming enamored with a corporeal life, which is nothing more than the delusive image of the true man, or the rational and immortal soul. Hence, by an immoderate attachment to this unsubstantial mockery and gliding semblance of the real soul, such a one becomes at length wholly changed, as far as is possible to his nature, into a vegetative condition of being, into a beautiful but transient flower, that is, into a corporeal life, or a life totally consisting in the mere operations of nature. Proserpina, therefore, or the soul, at the very instant of her descent into matter, is, with utmost propriety, represented as eagerly engaged in picking this fatal flower, for her faculties at this period are entirely occupied with a life divided about the fluctuating condition of the body. After this, Pluto, forcing his passage through the earth, seizes on Proserpina, and carries her away with him, notwithstanding the resistance of Minerva and Diana. They, indeed, are forbid by Jupiter, who in this place signifies fate, to attempt her deliverance. By this resistance of Minerva and Diana, no more is signified than that the lapse of the soul into a material nature is contrary to the genuine wish and proper condition, as well of the corporeal life depending on her essence, as of her true and rational nature. Well, therefore, may the soul in such a situation pathetically exclaim with Proserpina, "O flowers fatally dear, and mother's cautions despised, O cruel arts of cunning Venus." But according to Minutius Felix, Proserpina was carried by Pluto through thick woods and over a length of sea and brought into a cavern, the residence of the dead, whereby woods, a material nature, is plainly implied, as we have already observed in the first part of this discourse, and where the reader may likewise observe the agreement of the description of this particular with that of Virgil in the descent of his hero. Woods cover all the middle space, and Cocytus gliding on surrounds it with his dusky bosom. In these words, the woods are expressly mentioned, and the ocean has an evident agreement with Cocytus, signifying the outflowing condition of a material nature, and the sorrows and sufferings attending its connection with the soul. Pluto hurries Proserpina into the infernal regions. In other words, the soul is sunk into the profound depth and darkness of a material nature. A description of her marriage next succeeds her union with the dark tenement of the body. Night is with great beauty and propriety introduced as standing by the nuptial couch, and confirming the oblivious league. For the soul through her union with a material body becomes an inhabitant of darkness, and subject to the empire of night, in consequence of which she dwells wholly with delusive phantoms, until she breaks her fetters, is deprived of the intuitive perception of that which is real and true. In the next place, we are presented with a beautiful and pathetic description of Proserpina appearing in a dream to Ceres and bewailing her captive and miserable condition. Such indeed is the wretched situation of the soul when profoundly merged in a corporeal nature. She not only became captive and fettered, but lost all her original splendor. She is defiled with the impurity of matter, and the sharpness of her rational sight is blunted and dimmed through the thick darkness of a material night. The reader may observe how Proserpina, being presented as confined in the dark recesses of a prison and bound with fetters, confirms the explanation of the fable here given as a symbolical of the descent of the soul. For such, as we have already largely proved, is the condition of the soul from its union with the body, according to the uniform testimony of the most ancient philosophers and priests. After this, the wanderings of Ceres for the discovery of Proserpina commence. She is described by Minutius Felix as begirt with a serpent and bearing 2 lighted torches in her hands, but by Claudian, instead of being girt with a serpent, she commences her search by night in a car drawn by dragons. But the meaning of the allegory is the same in each, for both a serpent and a dragon are emblems of a divisible life subject to transitions and changes, with which, in this case, our intellectual and diviner part becomes connected. Since as these animals put off their skin and become young again, so the divisible life of the soul, falling into generation, is rejuvenized in its subsequent career. But what emblem can more beautifully represent the evolutions and outgoings of an intellectual nature into the regions of sense than the wanderings of Ceres by the light of torches through the darkness of night, and continuing the pursuit until she proceeds into the depths of Hades itself? For the intellectual part of the soul, when it verges toward body, enkindles indeed a light in its dark receptacle, but becomes itself situated in obscurity. And, as Proclus somewhere divinely observes, the mortal nature by this means participates of divine intellect, but the intellectual part is drawn down to earth. The tears and lamentations, too, of Ceres in her course are symbolical both of the providential operations of intellect about a mortal nature and the miseries with which such operations are, with respect to imperfect souls like ours, attended. Nor is it without reason that Iacchus or Bacchus is celebrated by Orpheus as the companion of her search, for Bacchus is the evidence symbol of the imperfect energies of the intellect and its scattering into obscure and lamentable dominions of sense. But our explanation will receive additional strength from considering that these sacred rites occupied the space of 9 days in their celebration, and this, doubtless, because, according to Homer, this goddess did not discover the residence of her daughter till the expiration of that period. For the soul, in falling from her original and divine abode in the heavens, passed through the 8 spheres, namely the fixed or inerratic sphere, and the 7 planets, assuming a different body and employing different faculties in each, and becomes connected with the sublunary world in a terrene body as the 9th and most abject gradation of her descent. Hence, the first day of initiation into these mystic rites was called agurmos, that is, according to Hesychius, ecclesia, and pantoageromenon, an assembly and an all collecting together. And this with the greatest propriety, for according to Pythagoras, the people of dreams are souls collected together in the galaxy, and from this part of the heavens, souls first begin to descend. After this, the soul falls from the Tropic of Cancer into the planet Saturn, and to this the second day of initiation was consecrated, which they called Alade Mustae, to the sea, ye initiated ones. Because, says Mercius, on that day the crier was accustomed to admonish the Mustae to betake themselves to the sea. Now, the meaning of this will be easily understood by considering that, according to the arcana of the ancient theology, as may be learned from Proclus, the whole planetary system is under the dominion of Neptune, and this too is confirmed by Martianus Capella, who describes the several planets as so many streams. Hence, when the soul falls into the planet Saturn, which Capella compares to a river, voluminous, sluggish, and cold, she then first merges herself into fluctuating matter, though purer than that of a sublunary nature, and of which water is an ancient and significant symbol. Besides, the sea is an emblem of purity, as is evident from the Orphic hymn to Ocean, in which that deity is called Theon Agnisma Megiston, the greatest purifier of the gods, and Saturn, as we have already observed, is pure, intuitive intellect. And what still more confirms this observation is that Pythagoras, as we are informed by Porphyry in his life of that philosopher, symbolically called the sea a tier of Saturn. But the 8th day of initiation, which is symbolical of the falling of the soul into the lunar orb, was celebrated by the candidates by repeated initiation and second sacred rites, because the soul in this situation is about to bid adieu to everything of a celestial nature, to sink into a perfect oblivion of her divine origin and pristine felicity, and to rush profoundly into the region of dissimilitude, ignorance, and error. And lastly, on the 9th day, when the soul falls into the sublunary world and becomes united with a terrestrial body, a libation was performed, such as in usual sacred rites. Here the initiates, filling 2 earthen vessels of broad and spacious bottoms, which were called pneumokoi and kotulouskoi, the former of these words denoting vessels of a conical shape, and the latter small bowls or cups sacred to Bacchus. They placed one toward the east, the other toward the west, and the first of these was doubtless, according to the interpretations of Proclus, sacred to the earth and symbolical of the soul proceeding from an orbicular figure, or divine form, into a conical defluxion and terrene situation, but the other was sacred to the soul and symbolical of its celestial origin, since our intellect is the legitimate progeny of Bacchus. And this too was occultly signified by the position of the earthen vessels, for according to a mundane distribution of the divinities, the eastern center of the universe, which is analogous to fire, belongs to Jupiter, who likewise governs the fixed an inerratic sphere, and the western to Pluto, who governs the earth, because the west is allied to earth on account of its dark and nocturnal nature. Again, according to Clement of Alexandria, the following confession was made by the new initiate in these sacred rites, in answer to the interrogations of the Hierophant. I have fasted, I have drank the kukeion, I have taken out of the kista, and placed what I have taken out into the calathus, and alternately I have taken out of the calathus and put into the kista. But as this pertains to a circumstance attending to the wanderings of Ceres, which formed the most mystic and emblematical part of the ceremonies, it is necessary to adduce the following arcane narration, summarily collected from the writings of Arnobius. The goddess Ceres, when searching through the earth for her daughter, in the course of her wanderings arrived at the boundaries of Eleusis, in the Attic region, a place which was then inhabited by a people called autochthonies, or descended from the earth, whose names were as follows: Bauboe and Triptolemus, Disaules, a goatherd, Eubulus, a keeper of swine, and Eumolpus, a shepherd, from whom the race of the Eumolpidae descended, and the illustrious name of the Cecropidae was derived, and who afterward flourished as bearers of the caduceus, hierophants, and criers belonging to the sacred rites. Bauboe, therefore, who was female, received Ceres, wearied with complicated evils, as her guest, and endeavored to soothe her sorrows by obsequious and flattering attendance. For this purpose, she entreated her to pay attention to the refreshment of her body, and placed before her a mixed potion to assuage the vehemence of her thirst. But the sorrowful goddess was averse from her solicitations, and rejected the friendly officiousness of the hospitable dame. The matron, however, who was not easily repulsed, still continued her entreaties, which were as obstinately resisted by Ceres, who persevered in her refusal with unshaken persistency and invincible firmness. But when Bauboe had thus often exerted her endeavors to appease the sorrows of Ceres, but without any effect, she at length changed her arts, and determined to try if she could not exhilarate, by prodigies or out-of-the-way expedients, a mind which she was not able to allure by earnest endeavors. For this purpose she uncovered that part of her body by which the female sex produces children and derives the appellation of woman. This she caused to assume a purer appearance and a smoothness such as is found in the private parts of a child. She then returns to the afflicted goddess, and in the midst of those attempts which are usually employed to alleviate distress, she uncovers herself and exhibits her secret parts, upon which the goddess fixed her eyes and was diverted with the novel method of mitigating the anguish of sorrow, and afterward, becoming more cheerful through laughter, she assuages her thirst with the mingled potion which she had before despised. Thus far Arnobius, and the same narration is epitomized by Clement of Alexandria, who is very indignant at the indecency as he conceives in the story, because it composed the arcana of the Eleusinian rites. Indeed, as the simple father, with the usual ignorance of a Christian priest, considered the fable literally, and as designed to promote indecency and lust, we cannot wonder at his ill-timed abuse. But the fact is, this narration belonged to the aporeta, or arcane discourses, on the account of its mystical meaning, and to prevent it from becoming the object of ignorant declamation, licentious perversion, and impious contempt. For the purity and excellence of these institutions is perpetually acknowledged even by Dr. Warburton himself, who, in this instance, has dispersed, for a moment, the mists of delusion and intolerant zeal. Besides, as Iamblichus beautifully observes, exhibitions of this kind in the mysteries were designed to free us from licentious passions, by gratifying the sight, and at the same time vanquishing desire, through the awful sanctity with which these rites were accompanied. For, says he, The proper way of freeing ourselves from the passions is first to indulge them with moderation, by which means they become satisfied. Listen, as it were, to persuasion, and may thus be entirely removed. This doctrine is indeed so rational that it can never be objected to by any but quacks in philosophy and religion. For as he is nothing more than a quack in medicine who endeavors to remove a latent bodily disease before he has called it forth externally, and by this means diminished its fury, so he is nothing more than a pretender in philosophy who attempts to remove the passions by violent repression instead of moderate compliance and gentle persuasion. But to return from this digression, the following appears to be the secret meaning of this mystic discourse. The matron Bauboe may be considered as a symbol of that passive, womanish, and corporeal life through which the soul becomes united with this earthly body, and through which, being at first ensnared, it descended, and as it were was born into the world of generation, passing by this means from mature perfection, splendor, and reality into infancy, darkness, and error. Ceres, therefore, or the intellectual soul, in the course of her wanderings, that is, of her evolutions and goings forth into matter, is at length captivated with the arts of Bauboe, or a corporeal life, and forgets her sorrows, that is, imbibes oblivion of her wretched state in the mingled potion which she prepares. The mingled liquor being an obvious symbol of such a life, mixed and impure, and on this account liable to corruption and death, since everything pure and unmixed is incorruptible and divine. Here it is necessary to caution the reader from imagining that because according to the fable the wanderings of Ceres commence after the abduction of Proserpina, hence the intuitive intellect descends subsequently to the soul, and separate from it. Nothing more is meant by this circumstance than that the diviner intellect, from the superior excellence of its nature, has in cause, though not in time, a priority to soul, and that on this account a defection and revolt and descent earthward from the heavenly condition commences from the soul and afterward takes place in the intellect, yet so that the former descends with the latter in inseparable attendance. From this explanation, then, of the fable, we may easily perceive the meaning of the mystic confession, "I have fasted, I have drank a mingled potion," etc. For by the former part of the assertion, no more is meant than that the higher intellect, previous to imbibing of oblivion through the deceptive arts of a corporeal life, abstains from all material concerns, and does not mingle itself, as far as its nature is capable of such abasement, with even the necessary delights of the body. And as to the latter part, it doubtless alludes to the descent of Proserpina to Hades, and her re-ascent to the abodes of her mother Ceres, that is, to the outgoing and return of the soul, alternately falling into generation, and ascending thence into the intelligible world, and becoming perfectly restored to her divine and intellectual nature. For the Kista contained the most arcane symbols of the mysteries, into which it was unlawful for the profane to look, and whatever were its contents, we learn from the hymn of Callimachus to Ceres that they were formed from gold, which from its incorruptibility is an evident symbol of an immaterial nature. And as to the calathus or basket, this, as we are told by Claudian, was filled with the spoliis agrestibus, the spoils or fruits of the field, which are manifest symbols of a life corporeal and earthly, so that the candidate, by confessing that he had taken from the kista and placed what he had taken into the calathus, and the contrary, occultly acknowledged the descent of his soul from a condition of being supermaterial and immortal into one material and mortal, and that on the contrary, by living according to the purity which the mysteries inculcated, he should reascend to that perfection of his nature from which he had unhappily fallen. It only now remains that we consider the last part of this fabulous narration or arcane discourse. It is said that after the goddess Ceres, on arriving at Eleusis, had discovered her daughter, she instructed the Eleusinians in the planting of corn, or, according to Claudian, the search of Ceres for her daughter through the goddess, instructing in the art of tillage as she went, proved the occasion of a universal benefit to mankind. Now the secret meaning of this will be obvious by considering that the descent of the superior intellect into the realms of generated existence becomes, indeed, the greatest benefit and ornament which a material nature is capable of receiving. For without this participation of intellect in the lowest department of corporeal life, nothing but the irrational soul and a brutal life would subsist in its dark and fluctuating abode, the body. As the art of tillage, therefore, and particularly the growing of corn, becomes the greatest possible benefit to our sensible life, no symbol can more aptly represent the unparalleled advantages arising from the evolution and procession of the intellect with its divine nature into a corporeal life than the good resulting from agriculture and corn. For whatever of horrid and dismal can be conceived in night, supposing it to be perpetually destitute of the friendly illuminations of the moon and stars, such and infinitely more dreadful would be the condition of an earthly nature, if deprived of the beneficent irradiations and supervening benefits of the diviner life. And this much for an explanation of the Eleusinian mysteries, or the history of Ceres and Proserpina, in which it must be remembered that, as this fable, according to the excellent observation of Sallust already adduced, is of the mixed kind, though the descent of the soul was doubtless principally alluded to by these sacred rites, yet they likewise occultly signified, agreeable to the nature of the fable, the descending of divinity into the sublunary world. But when we view the fable in this part of its meaning, we must be careful not to confound the nature of a partial intellect like ours with one universal and divine. As everything subsisting about the gods is divine, therefore intellect, in the highest degree, and next to this soul, and hence wanderings and abductions, lamentations and tears, can here only signify the participations and providential operations of these in inferior natures, and this in such a manner as to not derogate from the dignity or impair the perfection of the divine principle thus imparted. I only add that the preceding exposition will enable us to perceive from the meaning and beauty of the following representation of the abduction of Proserpina from the Haliacan tables of Hieronymus Aleander. Here, first of all, we behold Ceres in a car drawn by two dragons, and afterwards Diana and Minerva with an inverted Calathus at their feet, and pointing out to Ceres her daughter Proserpina, who is hurried away by Pluto in his car, and is in the attitude of one struggling to be free. Hercules is likewise represented with his club in the attitude of opposing the violence of Pluto, and last of all, Jupiter is represented extending his hand as if willing to assist Proserpina in escaping from the embraces of Pluto. I shall therefore conclude this section with the following remarkable passage from Plutarch, which will not only confirm, but be itself corroborated by the preceding exposition. Quote, "The ancient physiology, both of the Greeks and the barbarians, was nothing else than a discourse on natural subjects, rolled up or veiled in fables, concealing many things through enigmas and under-meanings, and also a theology taught in which, after the manner of the mysteries, the things spoken were clearer to the multitude than those delivered in silence, and the things delivered in silence were more subject to investigation than what was spoken." This is manifest from the Orphic verses and the Egyptian and Phrygian discourses, but the orgeia of initiations and the symbolical ceremonies of sacred rites especially exhibit the understanding had of them by the ancients. End of The Eleusinian Mysteries by Thomas Taylor, published 1891, read by Dan Attrell.